Lesson 23 is one of the most important parts of learning Latin. It's the indirect discourse. It's one of the first kinds of complex sentence that you will learn. So indirect discourse, in order to do that, you've already learned it a little bit, indirect statement. There's two kinds of indirect discourse, indirect question, indirect statement. So far you've learned indirect statement a little bit. Now you learn it completely. It's a good way to do it, to break it up into two lessons basically. So in order to do the indirect statement or indirect discourse, you have to know the morphology or how to conjugate and decline, for example, the infinitive in the active voice. You have to know the infinitive in the passive voice, which I'll review as well, and the infinitive in the active voice first. To do the infinitive present active, that's the second principal part. It's the second thing in the dictionary. That's easy, like amo, amari. That's the infinitive present active. To do the infinitive future active, you take the fourth principal part, you drop the us, the ar, the and you add urus, ura, urum, and then you add essa. So for example, you'd have amaturus, essa for the masculine, or amatura, essa, or amaturum, essa, depending on the gender that you want to express. Here it is right down here. And to do the infinitive perfect active, you take the third principal part, you drop the I, as you always do with the third principal part, and then you add isse. And here it is, if you have amo, it'd be amawi, and then you drop the I and add isse. There are your three infinitives in the active voice that you need to know in order to be able to read and create sentences of indirect statement or indirect discourse. I already pointed out to you that there are two varieties of indirect discourse. One is indirect questions, one is indirect statements. Today you're just going to learn indirect statement first. They both are similar to each other, but they're not completely the same, so you learn one at a time. Both indirect statement and indirect questions consist of a main clause and a subordinate clause of indirect discourse. So the formula is the same as it is throughout this class for complex sentences. There's always some kind of main clause, and then you have to figure out the weird things that happen in the subordinate clause. That's the formula. The main clause indicates to you that something is different. In this case, it's indirect statement. And then because the main clause signals something to you, you have to memorize the rules for how the subordinate clause behaves. The main clause indicates something to you. The subordinate clause does something unusual that you're not used to in Latin. This is where the class gets a little bit complex because you actually have to understand things that cannot be translated literally. So for a clause of indirect statement, the indicator is very easy. The main clause in a clause of indirect statement is going to consist most notably or primarily of a verb of saying, knowing, thinking, or perceiving, and anything like those words. So here's a list. If you want to pause the recording, it's a pretty comprehensive list right here of the verbs of saying, dico, nego, ait, etc. The verbs of knowing, disco, skio, nescio, intelligo. The verbs of thinking, the verbs of perceiving, and then one more word, inquam, which means I said, which takes direct discourse except in poetry. So in poetry, this would be used also in indirect statement. In direct discourse, usually it's used in direct discourse, but in poetry, you can add this to the list. That's why I've put a space here to set it off from the regular list of verbs of saying, knowing, thinking, and perceiving. Just so you can see that list with a little more detail. If you see any of these verbs, then you know that your main clause is signaling to you that you are in indirect statement. An indirect statement has funny rules for the subordinate clause. Now the subordinate clause, or the clause of indirect discourse, is introduced by the main clause. So as soon as you see the verb of he said, for example, she is pretty, You have the pattern I'm talking about. You have the main clause, he said, that's a verb of saying, thinking, knowing, and perceiving. And then you have the clause of indirect discourse, she is pretty. You're basically quoting him. He said is the main clause, she is pretty is the clause of indirect discourse. You're quoting what he said. The most important point, the most difficult point about indirect discourse is that when a statement is put into a clause of indirect discourse or indirect statement, the verb must be put into the infinitive mood and the subject must be put into the accusative case. We've already gone over this, but now you're going over it again for review and in greater detail. I've shown you before that this happens sometimes in English depending on what verb you use. You can say, I find, which is a verb of perceiving or knowing, or, I consider, a verb of saying, knowing, thinking, or perceiving. I find her, which is in the accusative, even though it's the subject of the indirect statement, to be, which is in the infinitive, intelligent. So I find is the main clause, her to be intelligent is the clause of indirect statement or indirect discourse. Same thing, I consider, that's the main clause. And then everything after that, him to be the best is the clause of indirect discourse or indirect statement. One or the other term is fine. You'll note that him is in the accusative and to be is in the infinitive. That's not the normal way you do it in English. Normally in English you would say something like, I say she is intelligent. There's no accusative and no infinitive in that sentence. I say is the main clause. She is in the nominative as it should be. You don't say in English, I say her to be intelligent. That sounds awkward. Although you do it sometimes in English, and you always do it in Latin. The main point of this lesson is to talk about the time expressed by the clause of indirect discourse. Indirect statements may be characterized by the time which is expressed in the clause of indirect discourse relative to the main clause. It's all about relative time. There are three options, and this is the crucial point that students have difficulty with. The clause of indirect discourse can express the same time as the main verb. It can express time after the main verb, or it can express time before the main verb, but you'll note that all those arrows go back to the main clause, which is where the main verb of saying, knowing, thinking, or perceiving is. The clause of indirect statement is completely relative to the main clause. Whatever time the main clause happens at, the clause of indirect statement can only express relative time in regard to it. Now that may be difficult to understand when I explain it in words. You'll understand it better when I give examples. But look at the rules and write notes down so that when the screen changes, it still makes sense to you. To express the same time as the main verb, use the infinitive present. If you want to express time after the main verb, use the infinitive future. That makes sense because the future comes after. After for the future. To express time before the main verb, use the infinitive perfect. That also makes sense because the perfect tense is the time before. It's the past tense. So same time is the infinitive present, time after is the future, and time before is the perfect. Quite logical, yet nonetheless, it's difficult to apply. Look at some examples. Same time I already told you is expressed by the infinitive present. So in this main clause, it's dikunt. That means they say, and dikunt happens to be in the present tense. Dikunt puerum invenire puellam. Note that puerum is in the accusative, even though it's the subject of the indirect statement, and invenire is in the infinitive, because it's in the clause of indirect statement. Puerum's in the accusative, so is puellam. So how do I know puerum is the subject of the indirect statement? Because puerum comes first. Sometimes you could have two accusatives. in a clause of indirect statement. The one that comes first has got to be the subject. So this one says, Dicunt puerum invenire puellum. They say, the boy, puerum, invenire, finds the girl. They say that the boy finds the girl. She was missing and he found her. So because you use invenire in the infinitive present in the clause of indirect statement, that means it happens at the same time as the main verb. The main verb is happening at the present. Invenire is happening at the same time as the main verb, so invenire is also happening at the present time. That's simple. So you can clarify this sentence by saying the boy finds the girl at the same exact time that the sentence is spoken. Let's look at that. May be too over the top, too detailed. Most people don't speak like that. But that's how explicit Latin is. The next one says, they will say, that's in the future, that's the main clause. That one word is the main clause. Everything else happens relative to the main clause. They will say, the boy finds the girl. Or they will say that the boy finds the girl. Latin obviously doesn't have a word for that, but you can put it in there if it sounds more natural to you. They will say that the boy finds the girl. Again, I've used the infinitive present, so the verb they will say is in the future. And since I use the infinitive present, it happens relative to the main clause, which means it also happens in the future. Every time I use the infinitive present, it becomes the same time as the main clause. It always expresses the same time. If the main clause is in the future, the infinitive present's in the future too. If the main clause is in the past, then the infinitive present is in the past too. If the main clause is in the present, the infinitive present is in the same time in the present. Look at the last example. Decebat, that's the imperfect, that's a past tense. That's the main clause. They used to say, or they were saying, that's the main clause, that the boy finds the girl. Invenire is an infinitive present, and since the main clause happens in the past, that means that the subordinate clause happens at the same time, which is in the past. No matter when the main clause happens, the infinitive present expresses the same exact time. So look, all of these sentences use the infinitive present, so they all take place at the same time as their main verb. If the main verb's in the future, so is the infinitive present. If the main verb is in the past, the infinitive present expresses the past. If the main verb is in the present, then the infinitive present is also in the present. The infinitive present can be whatever time the main clause is. I know I'm calling it the infinitive present, but it takes the time of the main clause. That's what I meant by, once you have a main clause that signals something, what happens in the subordinate clause, or in this case the clause of indirect discourse, is wacky. It's not what you would expect. The present all of a sudden isn't necessarily the present. So look at these examples. Dixerunt, that's the past tense. They said, the boy finds the girl. They said in the past tense that the boy finds the girl in the past. In other words, they said yesterday that the boy finds the girl yesterday. Because invenire is the present infinitive, it happens at the same time as the main verb. If the main verb happens in the past, then invenire also morphs into the past. They said yesterday that the boy finds the girl yesterday. Once you understand that pattern, everything else should be simple. If you want to express time after the main verb, use the infinitive future. Not the infinitive present, the infinitive future. But don't get confused. The future isn't going to be the future necessarily anymore. Look at the first example. They say, there's your main clause, all by itself. That main clause could have more words in it, but I'm using a simple example, so I'm just using one word. They say. They say in the present, or they say right now, that the boy, here's your infinitive future, they say the boy is about to find the girl. Or they say that the boy will find the girl. So the main clause happens in the present, but the infinitive future happens after, the time after the main verb. Not like the infinitive present, that happens at the same time. The infinitive future happens after the main clause. So they say right now that the boy will find the girl later or after. Look at the next one. They will say, there's your main clause, decant, that the boy is going to find the girl. Here's again is the infinitive future. It's a two-part word, inventurum and esse. They will say that the boy will find the girl. So they will say tomorrow, let's say, that the boy will find the girl. After tomorrow. The infinitive future has to be even further in the future than the word decant, which is already in the future. So they will say in the year 2016 that they will find the girl in 2017. You see, the main verb is in 2016. The future verb, even further in the future, has to happen in 2017. Or I should update these dates to put them far in the future. They will say in the year 2025 that the boy will find the girl in the year 2075. You see, the main clause happens in the future, but the subordinate clause happens even further in the future because it's expressing the time after, because it's the infinitive future. Now look at this one. Decabant. That's the past tense. They were saying, back on Monday, that the boy will find the girl. They were saying that the boy will find the girl. So if the main clause happens in the past, like let's say it happened on Monday, then the infinitive future expresses sometime after Monday. Could be Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, but it has to be sometime after the main clause. Another example. Dixerunt, that's the past tense. That's the indicative perfect active. They said that the boy is going to find the girl. Main verb is dixerunt. What's the mood tense voice person and number of inventurum? That's the infinitive future active. Infinitive future active always happens after the main verb. So this says, they said the boy will find the girl. Just like the previous one did in the imperfect. Can't really tell them apart. The perfect and the imperfect are almost indistinguishable. They said in the past that the boy will find the girl in the future. Simple. Infinitive future always happens in the future. Infinitive present always happens at the same time as the main verb. And then again, if you understand those first two, the next one should be just as easy. To express time before the main verb, use the infinitive perfect. So this one says, they say, present tense, the boy found the girl. This is the infinitive perfect, so it happens before the main verb. They say now that the boy found the girl before. Not after, not at the same time, but before. Here's the past tense. They said in 1987 that the boy found the girl. Even before 1987, they said that the boy found the girl in 1978 because the infinitive perfect happens before the main verb. They will say, there's your main clause, that the boy found the girl. They will say in the year 2019 that the boy found the girl before 2019, all the way back in 1949. And dikebat, they used to say that the boy found the girl. It's the infinitive perfect, so it happens before. They used to say back in the 80s that the boy found the girl back in the 60s. The infinitive perfect has to happen before the main verb, no matter when the main verb happens. If the main verb happened in the past, then the infinitive perfect happened even further back in the past. If the main verb happened in the future, then the infinitive perfect happens before the future. And if the main verb happens in the present, the infinitive perfect still happens before the present. Future happens after the main verb. Present happens the same time as the main verb. Perfect happens before the main verb. There's also no difference if you use the passive voice. I just want to show it to you real quick. Naturally, all the same rules apply if you use the active voice or the passive voice. Here's an example from real Latin, so it's a little convoluted. It says, many people say, that's the main clause. It's weird because the main clause is divided up with other words. That's how real Latin works. It's not baby Latin, it's not dumbed down Latin. Here's the kind of Latin you would read if you're reading, authors that are actually worth preserving and reading. They say, many people say, or many people are said to be, because it's the passive voice, many are said to be about to do the same thing. Many people are said, esse, to be, facturi, about to do the same thing. That's the infinitive future, so it happens after the main verb decuntur. Decuntur is in the present tense. The infinitive future happens after the present, every single time. Here again are some examples. They're not complicated if you've understood the pattern so far. They say that the girl is to be found by the boy. Since this is the infinitive present passive, it happens at the same time as the main verb. No matter what time the main verb is, the infinitive present, active or passive, happens at the same time. This is the future, and so the infinitive present is also in the future, same time. This one is the past, and so the infinitive present also happens in the past. The first one is in the present, so the infinitive present also happens at the same time. It's a no-brainer. Obviously, the same pattern applies if you use the infinitive future passive, which is rare. It would happen after the main verb. For example, they say that the girl will be found by the boy. This verb happens after the main verb. If the main verb is in the past, this future still happens afterwards. And then same thing for time before. They say that the girl has been found by the boy. Passive. In ventam esse is the infinitive perfect, so it happens before the present. It happens before the past, it happens before the past, and it happens before the future. Every single time, the pattern stays the same. The present happens at the same time, the future happens after, and the perfect happens before the main verb. A minor point here, reflexive pronouns used in indirect statement function the way they always do. Reflexive pronouns refer back to the same subject as the main clause. You see how everything is relative to the main clause. Reflexive pronouns refer back to the same subject as the main clause. So if you use a reflexive pronoun in indirect statement, it means that the subject of the main clause and the subject of the indirect statement clause are exactly the same. So for example, illa dicit, there's your main clause, that girl, or that woman, that girl said, there's your main clause, say, which is your reflexive pronoun, that girl said she, meaning that girl, it's the same as the main clause, that girl said that she herself was present yesterday. Adesse hodie. Hodie is yesterday. Adesse means was present. And note there that when you have the adessa in the present, it means it happens at the same time as dicit. Dicit's in the past. That girl said yesterday that she herself was present yesterday. Present happens at the same time as the main clause. The main clause is in the past, so the infinitive present also happens in the past. Look at the second example. Illa dicit, there's your main clause. That guy said, illa dicit, that guy, dicit, said in the past tense. Then you move on to the main clause. That he, meaning himself, reflexive refers back to the same subject as the main clause. That guy said he was present Now, really, I could say, to make it a little bit more clear, that guy said he had been present. That would be even more effective, because ad fuissa is an past tense, and the main clause is also in the past tense, so I have to go further back into the past. Let me erase this and make that more clear. So illa is that guy. Dicit is said in the past tense, indicative perfect active. Then you move on to the subordinate clause. That guy said he, meaning himself, not somebody else. That guy said he himself had been present yesterday. Had been is even before the verb said, because ad fuessa is an infinitive perfect. It happens before dicit. Adessa is an infinitive present, so it happens at the same time as dicit. The verb nego, which I put up in that list of verbs of saying, knowing, thinking, perceiving, or believing. Nego is the way that you make a negative indirect statement. So, for example, look at letter A. It says, nego nautam adessa. That would say something like, I deny, there's your main clause, that a sailor is here. Adessa is the present, so it happens at the same time as nego, which is also the present. I deny right now that a sailor is here right now. Second example, taken from your stories, primum, at first, iitis, negebat, there's the word nego in the imperfect, there's your main clause. At first, Aedes denied, say, meaning he himself, not somebody else. At first, Aedes denied that he will give, or was going to give, traditurum esse is the infinitive future, so it happens after the main clause. At first, Aetes denied he would give, or will give, or is going to give the golden fleece to anyone, to Uli. Again, just look at the sentence. At first, Aetes denied he is going to give the golden fleece, the aureum velis, to, in the dative, anyone. Nego is the way to make a negative sentence, or to say that someone denies something. Same rules apply with the sequence of tenses. One simple last point after all that complicated stuff, the word quidam, or two final points rather, quidam is the adjective a certain, as in a certain person was here yesterday, or a certain woman was walking through the garden. It's declined just like qui, quae, quod, just like the relative pronoun, except you add dam on the end. The dam does not decline at all. So you go qui dam, that's the nominative singular masculine. Then you go genitive quius dam. The first part of the word declines, the second part doesn't. Then qui dam, the dam never changes. Then quem dam, etc., and so forth and so on. I'm not going to go through the entire declension of qui, quae, quod, because you've done that for 2 weeks in a row, and it's been incorporated into the lessons regularly after that. If you don't know qui, quai, quod, you have to know it, not only for the relative pronoun, but also because it's similar to the forms or the same as the forms for the interrogative pronoun, the interrogative adjective, and now qui, dom, quaidom, and quidom. And then the final point, the book neglects some of these forms, so make sure you write all of these down because you'll see them. Unus nauta is a mnemonic device to remember these so-called special adjectives. Special adjectives are kind of funny, and they don't decline the way that they should. Their principal parts make them look like a 2-1-2 adjective, masculine, feminine, neuter, look more or less like bonas, bona, bonum. There's the word unus, which means one, nullus, nolla, nollum, which means none, ullus, ulla, ullum means any, solus, sola, solum means only. Note that it spells out acrostically unus, U-N-U-S, and then this spells out nauta, sailor. Okay, neuter, neutera, neuterum means neither. Alter, altera, alterum looks basically like a bonas, bona, bonum, or a 2-1-2 adjective. Even if it ends in er, that's a form of the second declension, like puer, 2-1-2. Uter, utera, utrum, totus, tota, totum, and alias, alia, aliud. I'm sorry, uter just means the other. Didn't put in the English there, definition there. At any rate, these words right here are declined with an ius in the genitive singular, even though everywhere else they're declined as bonas, bona, bonum, just like a regular 2-1-2 adjective. In the genitive singular, they inexplicably have an ius of all genders, and they have an I in all cases of the dative singular. So their dative singular and their genitive singular, and all genders all genders is different than the regular 2-1-2 adjective. They have an ius and an I, where they should just have the regular 2-1-2 adjective endings.